Hello. Today we are bringing to you the first Smart Knowledge U podcast. So I guess we will make these kind of podcasts that will be just audio. Anytime I want to talk about topics that I guess I'll be rambling on for more than 15 minutes or so. And if it's less than 15 minutes, we'll be making videos, again, the normal videos that you've been seeing from Smart Knowledge U. This is JS Kim. I'm your host, and I am the managing director and founder of SmartKnowledgeU, which is a fiercely independent research, consulting, and education firm that focuses primarily on precious metals of gold and silver, and also educating people about the reality of how financial markets work. So we will actually be launching a new education product called Smart Wealth pretty soon, which is a comprehensive online education course that tackles topics of, I guess, the gaps that are absent in traditional academia, so in classrooms of institutional academics and business schools and MBA programs, because they don't really teach you how financial markets work at all. So we fill in those gaps with this new course that we're going to be launching within the next several months. Okay, so let's move on. So today is February 17th, and the topics we're going to address today, just off the top of my head, because it's not going to be real structured, but I'm going to talk about the potential Grexit, the Greek exit from the EU, and I'm going to talk about the Brian Williams scandal. If you guys don't know about it, I'll be getting into that soon. And we're also going to talk about, a myriad of other different topics as well that deal with understanding the truth and the difference between truth and reality and what the mainstream media reports about what's going on in global financial markets today. So the first thing we're going to address is the potential Greek exit from the euro. Now, it's very interesting because there is a new political party called Syriza that recently took over the Greek parliament, and they won a majority in the last Greek elections. And they're basically an anti-banking, anti-austerity party, and they've also inspired a similar party in Spain called Podemos, which is gaining a lot of momentum now, and people think Podemos will win the next Spanish elections. Now, interestingly enough, in the West, I've seen Syriza called everything from a communist party to a radical leftist party. And it's just attempts of the Western media, because they're run by this global banking cartel that's headed by the IMF and the World Bank, which are very, very colonialist in their approach to bailouts. And I'll get into bailouts again, because a lot of people really don't understand what bailouts mean, because the media is so entrenched right now with using these kind of buzzwords that people don't even know exactly what they mean. So what they mean and what people think they mean and the reality is often oceans apart. So I'll get into what bailouts actually mean in this podcast as well. So one thing I want to say is, look at the links below this podcast. Obviously, if you download it or just listening to it, you're not going to see any links, but you can go to my YouTube channel, Smart Knowledge U, and then find this podcast and then look at the links, because I'm going to provide a lot of links. And one is concerning the Greek finance minister, Yanis Varousfakis, who talks about wanting to help the Greek citizens and not bailing out these criminal banksters anymore and not ruining the future of Greece for these criminal banksters. So if you go listen to it, it's totally logical. If you listen to his interview, what he wants for, what he's trying to do, anybody would want for their own country. So, if you watch this interview, and I encourage everyone to go find the link and watch it, and don't read just what they're saying about Yanis Varousfakis and Syriza in the mass media. Go actually listen to his words. Never judge anything you hear on mass media until you can listen directly to these people themselves, instead of listening to what the mass media says about these people. And then preferably also an unedited interview, because a lot of times the mass media will edit interviews to put words in people's mouths that they didn't say, or try to basically advance a certain narrative if they don't like a certain person against that person. So try to find like an unedited interview, and I'm going to post one below, and you can even see how the interviewer tries to label Syriza as something they are not, and Yanis Varousfakis actually corrects this so-called journalist. And so that's very interesting to go watch. So what will happen? Because yesterday, February 16th, was actually the deadline the Eurogroup gave to Greece to either accept their bailout plan or be kicked out of the EU. But basically, they're just deadlocked. They've made zero progress, according to the leaders of Syriza, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister. And so the talks are still ongoing. So that deadline has passed, and it wasn't an absolute deadline, which I ever doubted it would be anyways. But if you listen to Varousfakis, he said, quote, "It's one thing to say you shouldn't have gotten into the euro, and it's quite another to say you should get out of the euro. If we backtrack, we fall off a cliff. This is my argument to everyone." So he said he's lost a lot of supporters in Greece that think that Greece should actually exit the euro, should go back to their domestic currency before the EU was brought under by the Russian banking cartel under the euro. And he, is basically making the argument that, yeah, if we're going back to when the euro started, then I would argue Greece should not become part of the EU and use the euro as their currency. But now that we're in, he's saying it's too difficult to get out without really causing a lot of ruin to the Greek economy. So it's interesting because it seems like they're going to try to keep using the euro, which actually I don't think is I disagree with Yanis Varousfakis in that regard, because they do have other alternatives. They do have the BRICS Development Bank. If they could get a loan without austerity measures, and then they could start, slowly working their way into recovery. If they could just get a loan that doesn't have all these covenants tied to it, but that hurts the people, which is typically the type of loans in colonialistic or colonialism type of loans that the World Bank and IMF gives to countries, and then all you see are these headlines like World Bank bails out Brazil or World Bank, but no, they're just enriching the bankers, or what these so-called bailouts are doing. So what they really need is a loan. They're saying a loan. They don't want an extension of the bailouts that they received in 2010, because that will just be extending the austerity measures as well. So they're trying to break away from what they call the Troika, the EU, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, which are all criminal institutions. And those are the funds that are basically overseeing Greece's finances since 2010. And what Varousfakis said back then is, he said, quote, this is what I'm going to explain about the bailouts. He said, the bailout was not a bailout of Greece in 2010. It was a bailout of the German and French banks. The German public was misled into thinking that this was money going to the Greeks. The Greek public was misled into thinking that this was our salvation, end quote. And obviously it wasn't. So that 240 euro billion bailout back then in 2010, the biggest in global history, is set to expire in February, the end of February. So that's why there's all these negotiations going on between your group and Syriza right now, because when that ends, Greece is basically bankrupt, and they think they'll default on all their debt instruments, which who holds the debt instruments? The bankers, the global bankers again. So again, the bailout is not bailing out Greek citizens. A bailout, the reason why the ECB is so intent on forcing an extension of the bailout on Greece is because they want to bail themselves out, because it's their wealth that's going to go down if Greece goes bankrupt. So, the interesting thing is, if you look at what happened, even going back to before that 240 billion bailout they're giving in 2010, that there are certain rules actually that existed where in the EU, and where hefty fines would be slapped on EU members if they didn't adhere to these rules. So, for example, there's a budget deficit limit of 3% of GDP, and they say total government debt shouldn't exceed 60%. But the truth of the matter is, there's been all kinds of Enron-like accounting with the books, where Greece has basically gotten around that 60% debt limit, and as far as even the limit of the budget deficit limit of 3% of GDP, in 2009 it was over 12%. So it was more than 4 times that much. And they're basically just cooking the books to hide this. And you know who was helping them cook the books was Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs basically issued a whole bunch of cross-currency swaps in which the government debt that Greece was issuing, they're issued in dollars and yen, that was swapped for euro debt. And then that euro debt was to be exchanged back into the original currencies at a later date. And in that way, that kept their covenants, kept them from breaking their covenants, even though it's just a matter of semantics. And then Goldman Sachs secretly arranged additional $1 billion of debt for the Greeks. But of course, since Goldman Sachs, the whole point of Goldman Sachs issuing that debt was not to help the Greeks out, but to just make themselves wealthy at the misery of the Greek citizens, they basically sold off all that debt to collect their money, to collect their profits a while ago. So they, of course, they charged a hefty commission because Greece was desperate at that point. So they charged a hefty commission, made a ton of money, and then they sold off that debt to the Greek banks. And currently, if you want to see that how bad things are for other countries in the world, they say Greece's debt right now is 177% of GDP. Well, look at Japan. Japan's debt is 245% of GDP. If you look at the U.S. is probably well over that, because they say there's only $17.7 trillion of debt, but everyone knows that's a lie because they don't include unfunded liabilities like Social Security and other healthcare costs that are unfunded liabilities. And if you include that, then it's over $220 trillion is the real U.S. debt. So if you look at it, really the only difference between Greece and Japan and Greece and U.S. is their power of the central banks, because the U.S. is their economics in some ways is just as bad as Greece. But the only reason it doesn't appear to be as bad as Greece is because the U.S. Federal Reserve has the power to create as much money as they want out of thin air, where the Greek central bank doesn't. So to keep people appeased, for instance, the U.S. Federal Reserve can create all this, print all this money, create it out of thin air, and then give people food stamps, because I believe it's 1 in 7 Americans are on food stamps. So think about that. Those are basically would be the 1 in 7 in Greece that are going hungry and having problems making ends meet because the Greek central bank doesn't have the power to do that. The U.S. they do, so it doesn't look as bad. The U.S. has the power. The U.S. Federal Reserve has the power to print as much, create as much money out of thin air to pay the interest on U.S. Treasury bonds, which is exactly the problem that the Greeks have. They can't pay the interest on the Greek bonds they issued because they're bankrupt. The U.S. government is also bankrupt if you look at the real debt of $220 trillion. But hey, it's no problem because their central bank has the power to create as much money out of thin air as they want. And so it's really, really odd how at times people don't understand the reality of what is really going on. Now, if you look at what's going on today, because I told you back in 2010 that bailout was not a bailout of Greek citizens, though it was sold to the Greek citizens that way. It's really a bailout of German and French bankers. And today, if you look at who holds a lot of this debt right now, well, you look at Dart Management, which is basically a vulture fund. And a vulture fund is exactly what it sounds like. It's a vulture that preys on the misery of other people to gain riches. So that's run by billionaire Kenneth Dart, who is an American, and a lot of the Greek debt that Dart Management owns is to be paid back this year, 2015. A lot of the other debt is owned by Aurelius Capital, another U.S. hedge fund, Loomis Sayles, a U.S. investment management firm, ABN AMRO, the largest Dutch bank in the world. So basically all these vulture banks and vulture funds, they feed off the carcasses of bankrupt nations. And they buy bonds from countries at outrageous interest rates when these countries are distressed and they are desperate for money. So in other words, they're basically like private corporate versions of the World Bank and the IMF. So DART was, just to give you an example, DART Management was estimated to buy these Greek bonds at 60 to 70 cents on the dollar. And then now, when they were paid back in 2015, of course, they'll seek to be paid back at 100 cents on the dollar for a 43% to 67% return on their money. At the same time that these bankers are forcing Greek banks to take a 75% loss on their Greek bond holdings. So how is that legitimate? How is that moral? Well, obviously it's totally immoral, totally criminal that they're forcing Greek bankers to take a 75% loss while they're getting a 67% profit on the same Greek bonds. And that's a difference of let me see, 152%. That is just unbelievable. And then also, that's what these bailouts are. They force thousands of small Greek investors that bought Greek bonds to take losses on the Greek bonds while all these vulture bankers go in and make a killing and get even more wealthy off the misery of people. And we look at DART Management, they're also suing Argentina because Argentina was smart and they just defaulted on their debt in 2002. Said, we're not going to pay you back because you criminal vultures are basically getting wealthy off the misery of our people. And so DART Management's seeking up to $2 billion in payments from Argentina, and they're trying to use the U.S. legal system to supersede the Argentinian courts, which have upheld the right to Argentina to default on those criminal type of arrangements, and try again. The U.S. is trying to force their empire on Argentina. So this bailout, don't confuse it for a second, because you will never get the facts in the real media. It's not about bailing out Greek citizens. It's about bailing out the criminal, immoral, filthy bankers and making the bankers rich off of the misery of millions of ordinary citizens. Now let me tell you, I told you I was going to discuss Brian Williams. Let me tell you why the Brian Williams story is so important. For a lot of you that don't know what the Brian Williams story is, he was a top news anchor in the United States, and he basically told a story of being embedded with U.S. troops in a Chinook chopper that was hit by RPG. If you don't know what an RPG is, it's a rocket-propelled grenade, and he said that he went down and he survived. And he told this lie for 12 years. For 12 years. So it finally his lie finally unraveled because basically one of the American soldiers that was in the chopper that was actually hit by the RPG called him out on Facebook and said, "You're lying, you are not there." So he was forced to fess up. And the interesting part about this is that a lot of people don't even think it's that big of a story. They say, oh, well, he was just trying to boost his own ego, and he was just trying to say, oh, I'm this courageous hero that's willing to risk my life to get news, and that's all it was about. But I don't think that's what it's about at all. I think it was about, and this is really important when it comes to the financial world, keeping journalists from getting the truth about what was actually happening in Iraq with the war. Because I think by saying that he survived and he was in a chopper that was hit by an RPG, that they're trying to tell journalists it's too dangerous for any of you to venture out of the approved zones in Iraq, in Afghanistan, that we tell you where you can go, and we can tell you only where you can move with U.S. troops. So you see only what we want you to see. So I think it was a story basically of selling a certain narrative about the war, and that's why the story is so important. Because if you look at what Scott McClellan wrote in a book in 2008, he wrote a book, he was basically George Bush's press secretary for 3 years, called What Happened Inside the Bush White House and Washington's Culture of Deception. He basically said, quote, "The press corps was under enormous pressure from corporate executives, frankly, to make sure that this was a war presented in a way that was consistent with the patriotic fever in the nation and the president's high approval ratings," end quote. So he said the word was from the Bush administration to, quote, really squash any dissent. And he wrote that in his book, and that was actually a quote from Katie Couric, who hosts NBC's show Today, which is a highly ranked, I believe it's highly ranked, but I know it's a highly popular TV show in America. And she wrote, quote, "I think it's one of the most embarrassing chapters in American journalism," end quote. Which is really funny because it's one of the most embarrassing chapters in American journalism. Like, she as a journalist is doing nothing really to reveal the truth today of what's going on in the financial world, what's going on in the wars that and the theater operations that the U.S. is engaged in today. So it continues to be the most embarrassing chapter in American journalism today. And if you want to look at it's funny, even the Washington Post, a so-called respected newspaper in the U.S., journalists Sue Schmidt and Vernon Loeb, they basically wrote about Jessica Lynch, who was a 19-year-old soldier in Iraq, who was a kindergarten teacher, and she said she wanted to become a kindergarten teacher, and she was in a convoy that they say was ambushed. And this is what they wrote, quote, they wrote, "Private Jessica Lynch, rescued Tuesday from an Iraqi hospital, fought fiercely and shot several enemy soldiers after Iraqi forces ambushed the Army's 507th Ordnance Maintenance Company, firing her weapon until she ran out of ammunition," U.S. officials said yesterday, end quote. So the only problem with that statement from Sue Schmidt and Vernon Loeb, which you should never believe these reporters again, ever again, if they're still working for the Washington Post, was that Jessica Lynch never had a weapon, she never fired any ammunition, and she was never hit by enemy fire, as they claimed, and she was never tortured by Iraqi captors, as was all claimed in newspapers and written like fact. And when this all came out that this was all untrue and just something to, again, serve the patriotic fervor of American citizens about the Iraqi war, the Washington Post ombudsman, Michael Getler, responded to the critics by saying, "Schmidt and Loeb are experienced reporters, and there's no reason to doubt they were told what they reported and by a source in whom they had confidence. They say it is certain that the description they use are included in sensitive internal intelligence reporting about the rescue. The official silence about Lynch, they suggest, may be due to intelligence classification, possible war and crime investigations, or other issues." So that's incredible. Even the ombudsman is vouching for these journalists when it turned out these journalists reported complete lies as fact and not holding the journalists' feet to the fire for basically doing any type of investigative journalism about what they are told, but just accepting what they are told as fact and reporting about it. Because all it would take would be a call to Jessica Lynch to find out that it was wrong. But no journalist did that. They say, "Hey, the government told us this, a government source, so we're going to accept this fact without question," which is unquestionably horrible journalism. And so, the news media reports she was taken prisoner, full of stab wounds and bullet holes, whisked off to a ragged Iraqi hospital, held for 8 days by vicious Iraqi guards, abused, and then rescued by elite Navy SEALs in an operation where she was still held prisoner. That never even happened. That is crazy. And in fact, they said even the Iraqi Fedayeen guards had fled the day before the rescue, so there was no danger whatsoever, and they didn't need Navy SEALs. It could have been a grunt that could have walked into the hospital. There was no resistance, no weapon fire. They could have walked right in, taken her, and walked right out. And they knew it. And they knew it. They said U.S. Army intelligence knew it. But they made, instead, this whole made-for-TV scenario of sending in SEALs in to make it look like this dramatic rescue that was entirely faked. So it's just incredible. And the reason why this is so important to learn that how even a lot about war reporting is totally made up, totally fake, is because if you can start connecting the dots, then you can start understanding how much about the war, about global finance is entirely faked. Because there have been many polls I've seen, some run by Gallup and other well-known polling institutions, that show that half of Americans think that America is recovering in 2015, despite numerous facts showing the economy is actually getting worse. And if you look, for example, at the too big to fail banks that control almost $4 trillion in commodity derivative contracts. Well, you know, a lot of those commodity derivative contracts are on oil. So what happened when oil went from $85 below 50 in less than a quarter? What is going to happen to a lot of those commodity derivative contracts? They're going to go belly up. 2014, Deutsche Bank had total derivative exposure of more than 75 trillion with a T dollars. So it's about 100 times greater than the 522 billion euros in deposits that the bank has. So just imagine if a small percent of those derivatives go belly up, that Deutsche Bank's going to be bankrupt. So, you know, and that also goes for, you know, it's really scary if you look at the OCC's quarterly report on bank trading and derivatives activities. The most recent report is for third quarter 2014. You have Citibank, JP Morgan, a lot of these top banks, Bank of America, in the exact same positions. They have like around 60-70 trillion dollars of derivatives. So just a fraction of those, a small percent, you know, like 2% of those derivatives go bad, those banks are going to be bankrupt. So if you look at all of these stats that are not being reported, the fragility of the system that's not being reported at all, you can start connecting the dots. If you look at even unemployment, it's ridiculous. The last non-farm payroll report, they said unemployment, I believe, was reported still at less than 6% in the United States. But what's ridiculous is if you actually look at how they calculate unemployment, they've been lying about unemployment rates for as long as you and I have been alive and longer. So, you know, they consider you employed even if you only work 10 hours a week. But who can actually make ends meet if you're not working at least 40 hours a week? So they say, you know, if you work 10 hours a week at McDonald's, then you're employed, even though you can't really earn a decent living with those parameters. And they say, okay, they include discouraged workers, or actually they don't include discouraged workers, which they define a person of legal employment age who's not actively seeking employment within the 4 weeks prior to the survey. So if they were not looking and seeking employment because they're so discouraged, they could have been unemployed for a year or 2 years, but they just say, oh, wasn't looking in the last 4 weeks. So even though you're unemployed, you're not unemployed according to bankers and U.S. government. So there's so many ways they rig the employment numbers to falsely to make it far lower, because the real unemployment rate is really around 23% or higher in the United States, not less than 6%. So if you look at involuntary part-time workers, which are basically workers that want to work full-time, but they can't find full-time work, in January 2015, that total 6.8 million. 6.8 million. There's 19.8 million that work part-time that don't work full-time. So how can the economy be improving if you have 7 million workers that want to work full-time but can't find jobs, full-time jobs? How can the economy be improving? It would have to get at least 7 million full-time jobs created to even fulfill those workers that are working part-time that want to work full-time, not to mention the ones that are discouraged, that are unemployed, that want to work, that the bankers don't even count as unemployed. So that's ridiculous, because you need to create tens of millions of jobs just to get the people employed that want to work. And those jobs are simply not there, but yet the meme that the government and the bankers want to sell you, the narrative, is that everything is getting better. So that's why you got to connect the dots with the whole Brian Williams fiasco, with what's going on with the total falsehood that's being portrayed all over the world. This isn't just in the US, this is also in the UK, this happened in Spain, in Italy, Portugal, Greece, everywhere, that you're not getting correct statistics from the government because the governments are run by bankers. Well, now that Syriza is taking over Greece, maybe, you know, you'll see better statistics. But, you know, it's just not unemployment, it's also inflation. Look at all the key housing starts. They're all falsified. If you actually would take the time to go and look and see how they're calculated, you would see that the method of calculation is just entirely ludicrous. So That's why Brian Williams is so important in my mind. Now, moving on, I saw just this morning that Lance Armstrong had a $10 million judgment against him to return basically salary, winnings, bonuses, whatever you want to call it, from a promotions company he worked with, Dallas-based SCA. So they went to arbitration panel. The arbitration ruled against Armstrong and former team owner Tailwind Sports Company to pay $10 million in fraud, because the arbitrators who decided on the $10 million award cited, quote, an unparalleled pageant of international perjury, fraud, and conspiracy, end quote, in determining the amount. And the arbitrators Richard Faulkner and Richard Chernick wrote, perjury must never be profitable. Lance Armstrong has justly earned wide public condemnation as an inadequate deterrent. Deception demands real and meaningful sanctions. So they said Armstrong collected bonuses from SCA, who was the plaintiff who won the $10 million judgment against Lance Armstrong. And they said SCA was also in line to pay a $5 million bonus when Armstrong won a record-breaking 6th Tour de France in 2004. So they disputed some of these bonuses in a 2005 arbitration, which they lost, and the case was settled $7.5 million in Armstrong's favor. But that was before, I think, the admission came out that he was doping and basically using performance-enhancing drugs to win all those Tour de France's. So they actually may be seeking to get another $5 million back from Lance Armstrong. Now it's funny because these arbitrators said no one should be rewarded for lying, cheating, and stealing, and that their deterrent has to be good enough to deter that kind of behavior from anyone else in the future. So why doesn't that hold to the banking world? That's what I want to know. They said Martha Stewart even went to jail for perjury. A lot of people don't know that. They think she went to jail for insider trading, but no, she went to jail for lying before Congress about her inside trade. So she actually was jailed for perjury. So why do not bankers go to jail once proved beyond a reasonable doubt that they lied? And there's plenty of examples out there. HSBC laundered at least $7 billion for the Sinaloa drug cartel, and that was just over a 2-year period of 2007 to 2008. And so if you look at it over time, they probably laundered tens of billions of dollars because they weren't caught for many years before that. So I wouldn't doubt if they laundered 10 times as much, as like $70 billion for the Sinaloa drug cartel. And it's funny too, because Upton Sinclair, who was a muckraker who wrote this famous book called The Jungle back in the 1930s about the child labor abuse that was going on in the meatpacking district in New York in the 1930s. He made this comment once. Let me see if I can find it. Just one second. Okay, I'm going to Google this. Okay. He said, still looking for it. Where is it? Okay, just bear with me one second. So I'm going to find it very soon, because this ties back to the comment I'm going to make about HSBC. Well, anyway, I'm having a little trouble finding this, but he basically said that, I'm going to just paraphrase it, that understanding the truth when someone's salary depends upon, or their livelihood depends upon, not understanding the truth, then he said those people will never seek out the truth. So, which, makes sense, because people always say, oh, I don't want to know the truth sometimes, and it comes back to, because if they know the truth, then they'll feel bad about actually working in a criminal institution. Oh, actually, I found it. So he said, quote, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. So why I wanted to bring that up is because when I told, I know several people that work for HSBC, several bankers, and I told them, how can you work for this like despicable criminal institution? And their reaction across the board was like, oh, come on, get out of here. You believe in all these conspiracy theories. They're like, oh, we didn't even know that we were laundering money. They really believe that. It's crazy. I don't know what their CEO, Stuart Gulliver, was sending to them, because I know he probably was sending out emails saying talking points of how to counter the fact that we laundered money from one of the most violent drug cartels in Mexico that literally murder tens of thousands of people. So we're basically aiding and abetting tens of thousands of murders by working with this and laundering billions of dollars for this violent drug cartel. So they actually said that, which is ridiculous, because I told these bankers I know, you're actually contradicting the most respected drug prosecutors' opinions in this matter, because they have looked at the HSBC case and they have said, from the complexity of the operations that HSBC was using to launder this money, he said there was beyond a shadow of a doubt. They said they have studied drug laundering operation their entire career and prosecuted against this. And they said there was no better case. They said if there ever was an airtight case against criminal banking activities, and the fact that the HSB executives knew, and could be proven in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt, that they knew exactly what they were doing and laundering this money for the Sinaloa drug cartel. They said this was it. They said if you can't send someone to jail for the type of case that existed against HSBC bankers, then you can never send anyone to jail. And I told them that the bankers still would not fess up. Because again, they don't want to understand the truth, because they don't understand they work for a despicable criminal bank like HSBC, which is crazy. And so, literally, if you're a banker for HSBC, you're aiding and abetting massive, massive crime, including murder. And you will say, oh, I don't really think that's true, so you can feel better about working for an organization that aids and abets murder, which is crazy. So, and if you look at it, right, because a lot of times governments are very they spew a lot of propaganda. Unfortunately, the leaders in a lot of countries try to get people to adhere to a very nationalistic view, meaning that they will not view human life in another country as much as they view human life in their own. So in other words, you have a Boston Marathon bombing in the US, and I believe 2 Americans died, and that's like major news everywhere. But if through war, there's hundreds of thousands or even millions of people killed of a different skin color, you never see protests. Like, well, I should not say you never, because of course there's always war protests, but not to the extent that the mass media, I'm blaming the mass media, not like all people's humanity, but there's also actually, people are just nationalistic because of government propaganda. They tend to value people's lives more the same with the same nationality. I've seen that even in Asia when I've been in Japan or Thailand trying to do some charity fundraiser. If it's for orphans in Burma, they don't want to take part of it. But I say, oh, if it's for Japanese orphans or if it's Thai orphans, I'll do that. I'll support it. But I'm not going to support it if it's Burmese orphans, which is ridiculous. It's just ridiculous, this kind of brainwashing that people have been subjected to. And that's the same too, because when they said U.S. war in Iraq killed at least 500,000 children in Iraq. And this was in 1996, so we had basically another couple decades of war in Iraq. So I believe that figure is now through direct munitions killing, and also through indirect, through like depleted, what do they call it? Depleted uranium munitions, so through radiation deaths. I think there's been over 1.5 million now killed in Iraq. But back in 1996, it was 500,000, 500,000 children, and they asked the to-be U.S. Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, about whether U.S. intervention was worth it. And she said, yes, it was worth killing 500,000 children. That's what's so crazy about it. And that's the kind of viewpoint that the government wants a lot, and the bankers want a lot of people to assume. is that as long as we're killing people that are not our own skin color, it doesn't matter. And that is kind of crazy. So you can't get really a lot of people, although there always will be people, because there's always people that are compassionate out there in every country and every nationality. But I think the brainwashing, unfortunately, has worked to a large extent. So you tell people, oh, look, these Mexican drug cartels that HSBC is supporting, they have murdered over 60,000 people between 2006, 2012. It doesn't matter. They're brown. It doesn't matter. That's what most people would look at it as. I'm not saying everyone, but I'm saying this brainwashing does work. You know, this kind of government banking brainwashing works. And but perhaps even if you say, then you can say, what about HSBC laundering money for Saudi terrorists? Because that certainly happened, because HSBC was working and made a lot of money with Albright, which was a big Saudi bank that basically, let me see, I'm going to look this up too. Okay, so there's a report that came out that said after the terrorist attack on 9/11 that Albright and some of its owners had links to financial organizations associated with terrorism. So they couldn't make exact links between Albright and the terrorists that committed 9/11, but even then, which is crazy, because it's very possible that, you know, the HSBC bankers, just because it's so profitable, were working with terrorists that came back to kill Americans. And even then, they said HSBC closed the account after this all came out with Albright, but then they reopened ties with them in 2006. And how many U.S. congressmen are up in arms about this? None. Or maybe one or two, you know? But this is not something you hear in the mainstream media, because the bankers have immunity from all kinds of criminality. So the type of financial earthquakes that we have seen, which is ridiculous, that like chartists will say, oh, you can predict everything from chartists. There's no manipulation in gold. There's no manipulation in oil. Tell me how many chartists predicted oil will go from $85 a barrel to less than 50 in less than 3 months. Tell me. I don't remember a single one. Tell me how many chartists predicted the Swiss franc was going to run up by 37% in 13 minutes, you know, recently. None. I'll tell you, none. Zero. And that's why, because chartists never want to account for fraud and manipulation, which is, you know, the reason why oil prices have been so volatile. The reason the Swiss franc has been so volatile is because of the fact of fraud in the global financial system and fraud and manipulation in these markets. Well, no, chartists want to say, oh, there's no manipulation. I can predict everything by these charts. And they don't even realize that bankers sometimes paint charts to goad them into saying what they say, which is so ludicrous. I mean, you look at these self-proclaimed futurists that, you know, look at charts like Harry Dent said gold will go to $700 in 2014, and so many people were worried. So he was just off because gold closed above 1,200. He's only off by 42%. But did the mainstream media say, oh, look at this clown, I'm going to take him off and I'm not going to interview him because he was off by 42%? No, they have him back on. And what does Harry Dent say? Gold is going to go to 700 in 2015. So it's ridiculous. You have to understand, and that's why I wanted to talk about Brian Williams, that nothing is as what it seems on the surface. You gotta dig below the surface. You have to understand that, you know, what's going on with oil, what's going on with the Swiss franc is not an aberration. It's because the whole financial system, global financial system, is broken. There are many more financial earthquakes are coming. I certainly believe in the second half of this year, if not sooner. And if you believe the mainstream media, you'll be blindsided. But you have to understand, these kind of markets, you have to remain nimble. Nimble is the key word. You can't just buy and hold. You got to be in and out. So by applying that whole strategy of being nimble, we are up just a tad under 6% in January with our newsletter. And this month, we've actually been out of the mining stocks the entire month. So we weren't subjected to that 10% or 8. I don't know. A lot of the mining stocks, as I've been tracking them, were down 8, 9, 10% this month. So we avoided that as well. So, you know, the point of this whole podcast is that if you connect the dots, you can always connect the dots with what's going on in the media, even if it doesn't seem related with Brian Will. All the lies they're telling. You know, they told all these lies about the war. You don't think they're going to tell the same lies about finance, about economics, about banks, about banks' health when they're really, a lot of these banks are bankrupt? You don't think they're going to tell you lies when they're telling you flat out lies about war to basically support a narrative to get people to support war. And why is that? How's that go back to bankers? Well, banking is a war racket in general U.S. And how does this affect everything, or how are the dots all connected? Well, they say war is a bankster racket, or banker racket. It was the name of a book by U.S. General Smedley Butler, and he realized in the 1920s and 1930s that every war that he was goaded into by the bankers on Wall Street was for their benefit only, and to the detriment of all American citizens and citizens all over the world. So I'll put the link to that below too on the YouTube podcast and details of the information, so you can go check out that link. And so you need to start connecting all the dots. We need to start connecting all the dots. Stupidly, in 2013, which was our worst year running our SmartKnowledgeU newsletter, it was because I, again, stupidly put too much faith into a lot of the data JP Morgan was reporting to the commission, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, because I'll put the link to this as well, because the CFTC actually released a press release, and they said that the CFTC order specifically finds that since at least 2012, the CFTC was notifying JP Morgan Stanley about errors in the large trader reports, which increased in frequency throughout the year. Now they go on to say, quote, however, JP Morgan Stanley continued to submit large trader reports that contain hundreds of errors throughout the period from February 1st, 2013 to February 2014. So that's for an entire year. And they didn't say 1 error, 10 errors, a dozen errors. They said hundreds of errors, meaning virtually all the reports to the CFTC were all falsified deliberately. And myself being a moron, put too much, I mean, like those that have been listening to me for a while know that I always say you can't trust the bankers, but I put the too much emphasis that they could serve as a proxy for certainly what they were doing in the futures markets, and that turned out to be completely wrong. So that's why we had the one, really bad year in 2013, because we listened to all of the lying, criminal, thieving, stealing JP Morgan bankers. But as I said, we were back on track last year, and then this year, again, we got off to a good start in January. But the moral of the story is really to take charge. And how you take charge of your own financial life is not to just to really understand and be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, to separate the lies of the mainstream media, the lies of the bankers from reality of what's really going on. I'm going to put another link. Here's a letter. I'm just going to read you part of it, but you can go see the link, which I'll put in the YouTube video again. And this was a letter written to the CFTC. It says, Dear CFTC staff, hello, I am a current JP Morgan Chase employee. So this comes from an insider. Can't read the whole thing, but you can go read the whole thing if you want. But there's a lot of great stuff in here, so I tried to read some of the really good parts. He's basically, I've seen the disruptive behavior of superiors and no longer can say that I look up to employees at the executive director, managing director level here at JP Morgan. Their smug exuberance and arrogance permeates the air just as pungently as rotting vegetables. They all know too well of the backdoor crony connections they share intimately with elected officials and other institutions, like the CFTC. That's my commentary, because obviously the CFTC are just as criminal as JP Morgan. It is apparent in everything they do, from the meager attempts to manipulate LIBOR, therefore controlling how almost all derivatives are priced, to the inherent fraudulent commodities manipulation. Yes, we at JP Morgan that are in the know are fearful of a cascading credit event being triggered in Greece, and that's very apropos for today, is they have hidden derivatives in excess of $1 trillion US. We at JP Morgan own enough of these through counterparty risk and outright prop trading that our entire international banking space could be annihilated within a few short days. I wish to remain anonymous as fear of now, as fear of termination mounts from what I am about to reveal. Robert Gottlieb is not my real name. However, he is a trader that is involved in a loose lawsuit for manipulative trading while working with JP Morgan Chase. He was acquired during our Bear Stearns acquisition and is known to be the notorious person shorting in the silver futures market from his trading space. Blah, blah, blah. And it goes on and on and on to talk about all the criminality. It says, again, we, meaning JP Morgan, started increasing our short positions quite significantly again in this most recent crash in gold and silver during Bernanke's speech on February 29th. It is of notable importance as we, along with 4 other major institutions, orchestrated the violent $100 drop in gold and subsequent drops in silver. And this was back in 2012. So we're in 2015 and nothing has changed. So that's why I say you have to seize control over your own future, because these criminal bankers have impunity from prosecution, jail. What do I think should happen? You know, in 2008, they said the CEOs of all of Wall Street's largest banks made $500 million each. Yes, they made $500 million, average of $50 million a year over 10 years. What do I think should happen for all the criminality? I think they should be, just like Lance Armstrong was forced to hand over all his bonus money from fraudulently winning all those Tour de France's. I believe every single penny from fraud, all the CEOs should be forced to pay them back. And not only should they be, that's not enough. They should go to jail as well. And JP Morgan made $6.5 billion of profits in 1 quarter in 2013. If we can find any of those profits, all those profits that are linked to fraud, deceit, criminality, they should be able to forced to pay all those profits back to the people that they stole from. And that goes not only for JP Morgan, goes for Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, and all these other criminal banks. So comment below, let me know what you think. Let me know if you believe that my solution of really being able to dig deep to do your own investigative research to find out what is the truth versus the lies that Brian Williams, that CNBC, that MSNBC, that CNN are telling, that the UK Guardian, that Forbes, that Fortune magazine are all telling, is the key to getting through this financial crisis. Fine, because I'm telling you, there are going to be much more greater shocks than just the euro decoupling, the Swiss franc decoupling from the euro, from oil going from 85 to below 50. There's going to be a lot more financial shocks coming. You will see them coming too, and take adequate action to protect your wealth if you basically look at, do investigative research of your own and really follow what is going on in reality, not what the mainstream media is saying. So do follow, do subscribe below to our SmartKnowledgeU channel. Do subscribe to our free newsletter in which we talk about things like this, and you'll be able to keep up to date future podcasts by subscribing to our free newsletter at www.smartknowledgeu.com. Check out our blog on that site as well. And those will probably be the 3 major mediums that we use. We're not huge on social media, but we do have like 13 or 14,000 followers on YouTube. We're probably going to get off Twitter very soon, because Twitter is just like another fraudulent social media, or at least they censor us all the time. You can go check our latest tweet, which we tried to reveal and expose more criminality of HSBC that they blocked, because we took a screenshot showing how they blocked it and the ridiculous comment they put up as far as why they blocked that tweet. I've noticed actually for a while too, and I've stopped tracking actually how many followers add me and how many unfollow, but there have been plenty of weeks where we've had a net 100+ followers, and our followers never change. And in fact, the number of followers has stayed around like 3,500 for a year, over a year now. I think it's been closer to like 18 months. That number has not changed at all. So we know that Twitter's not really adding any of our followers, and they don't want people to follow us. So we're just gonna, flip the bird to Twitter and get off of Twitter as well, and just do our own social media on other channels. Okay, so that's it for today. Thanks a lot for listening. As always, remember to remain intensely curious, and stay tuned for our next podcast. So long.